When we look at the smooth muscle, we can find it organized in two different ways. The smooth muscle cells can be organized as a single unit, or they can be organized as a multi-unit. As the name implies, a single unit smooth muscle is the one that, when stimulated, will contract as a single unit. Now, if these smooth muscle cells will contract as a single unit, that means that these muscle cells are joined by gap junctions. So the action potential that is one cell can quickly go to the next cell, and then these cells can all contract as a single unit. Now, in the multi-unit smooth muscle, guys, look at the name, multi-unit. You have a multitude of units. You have the smooth muscle cells not connected one to another. It is extremely rare to find gap junctions between the smooth muscle cells in the multi-unit smooth muscle. It is so rare that we usually say that there are no gap junctions between the smooth muscle cells that are in the multi-unit smooth muscle. And if they do not have gap junctions, they are not electrically coupled. So when one smooth muscle cell contracts, that cannot spread to the other cell that's next to it. So in the multi-unit smooth muscle, we have every single cell contracting when that specific cell is stimulated, but not because the stimulus came from another smooth muscle cell that was right next to it, because the cells are not communicating via gap junctions. And because of this arrangement, we have every single cell in the multi-unit smooth muscle contracting only when they are specifically stimulated. Now, where would be useful to have the single unit smooth muscle and the multi-unit smooth muscle? Guys, the single unit smooth muscle is useful where we need to have a single cell contracting, and as a consequence, all the other cells contracting, and we have all this smooth muscle in that organ contracting as a single unit. And we find the single unit smooth muscle in the walls of all visceral organs, with the exception of the heart that has cardiac muscle in the wall. And since the smooth muscle in a single unit is found in the wall of basically all visceral organs, the single unit smooth muscle is the one that's commonly called visceral muscle. And what is very interesting is that since we find the single unit smooth muscle in the wall of hollow organs, besides we having the autonomic nervous system telling the cells to contract, we also have the stretching of the hollow organ happening and causing the stimulation of the smooth muscle cell in this single unit. And when we have the stimulus coming from the inside the muscle itself, because, for example, it got stretched, that is called myogenic. Genic because it is generated, and myo muscle. So it was generated within the muscle because of the stretching of the hollow organ wall. Now, we also have this single unit smooth muscle answering to hormones. And the easy way to remember that the single unit smooth muscle answer to hormones is by remembering that the single unit smooth muscle is present in the uterine wall. Now, guys, the uterus is an organ in the female reproductive system. Females have uterus because babies develop inside the uterus. And the uterus has a very thick muscle wall. And when it's time for the birth of the baby, what happens? Contractions happen. Contractions happen to push the baby out. Now, with this in mind, would it be useful to have single unit smooth muscle in the uterine wall or a multi-unit smooth muscle in the wall? Guys, we need to have a single unit smooth muscle in the uterine wall because we need the whole uterus contracting as a single unit to push the baby out. If we had multi-unit smooth muscle in the uterine wall, we would need to have several stimulus making every single cell in the smooth muscle contracting at the same time to push the baby out. So no, it cannot happen. In the uterine wall, we need to have a single unit smooth muscle. Now, this single unit smooth muscle in the uterine wall is controlled by hormones. And the name of the hormone is specifically oxytocin. And when the oxytocin stimulates the single unit smooth muscle in the uterine wall to contract, the uterine wall contracts smooth and slowly. And I say smooth to make a reference to the smooth muscle, and slowly because it's much slower than the contraction of a cardiac muscle or the skeletal muscle. So the single unit smooth muscle contracts smooth and slowly, but this contraction is extremely powerful. Powerful enough to push the baby out. So remembering the uterus as an example of a single unit smooth muscle because the uterus needs to contract as a single unit to push the baby out, you can remember that the single unit smooth muscle is found in the wall of hollow organs. You can remember that the single unit smooth muscle has smooth and slow contractions, but they are extremely powerful. And you can remember that the single unit smooth muscle can be controlled by hormones. Now, besides being controlled by hormones, the single unit smooth muscle can be controlled by the mechanical stress caused by the stretching of the wall of hollow organs, which is what we call myogenic because it was generated within the muscle. And also, the smooth muscle organized in a single unit can be controlled by the nervous system. And when a muscle is controlled by the nervous system, we call neurogenic. The control is generated by the nervous system. Now, other examples of hollow organs besides the uterus would be blood vessels. We have single unit smooth muscle in the wall of our blood vessels. We have single unit smooth muscle in the wall of our urinary bladder. We have single unit smooth muscle in the wall of the organs of our alimentary canal. The alimentary canal, as we will cover in the digestive system, is the canal that the food we swallow passes. It is basically a tube that starts at the mouth and finishes at the anus. And all the organs in the alimentary canal have smooth muscle organized as a single unit in their walls. So when a smooth muscle cell in the single unit smooth muscle is stimulated, this stimulus passes to the cells that are right next to it because these cells in the single unit smooth muscle are connected by gap junctions. And when we have this stimulus spreading to the cells that are right next to it, we have these cells then contracting, and that will move the partially digested or digested food along the alimentary canal. And as it's shown in this diagram, the stomach, which is one of the organs that we have in the alimentary canal, has smooth muscle organized as a single unit in the wall. And when we study the stomach in the digestive system, I will show you that in the stomach wall, we have 3 smooth muscle layers. And these 3 smooth muscle layers are arranged in different directions so our stomach can have the most amazing contractions in all different directions possible. Now, the other type of smooth muscle we have is the multi-unit smooth muscle. And as I mentioned before, the multi-unit is the one that has a multitude of units. The smooth muscle cells are not talking to each other, and each individual cell needs to receive the stimulus to be able to contract. And what stimulates each smooth muscle cell in the multi-unit smooth muscle is a specific neuron. And if a smooth muscle cell responds to commands coming from neurons, we say that that specific smooth muscle is under neurogenic control. And the multi-unit smooth muscle is found in very specific places of our body. The multi-unit smooth muscle is found in our eyes, specifically in the colorful muscle of our eyes, which is named iris. And when the iris contracts and relaxes, it changes the size of the pupil, which is the hole we have exactly in the middle of our eye. And the size of the pupil is what allows more or less light to go into our eyeball. Another place we find multi-unit smooth muscle is in the ciliary body of our eyes. And the ciliary body is what controls how stretched or relaxed the lens in our eyes are. So basically, we have multi-unit smooth muscle controlling the accommodation of our eyes. Also, the multi-unit smooth muscle is the type of muscle that gives us goosebumps. Remember when we studied the arrector pili muscle when we went over the integumentary system? So yes, the arrector pili muscle is a multi-unit smooth muscle. And lastly, I need you guys to remember that we have multi-unit smooth muscle in the wall of very large blood vessels and also in the wall of very small airways. And it's very important to have the multi-unit smooth muscle in these 2 places because we really need to have fine control of when the muscles making up the wall of small airways contract and also when the smooth muscle making up the wall of very large blood vessels contract. And with that in mind, you can remember that the multi-unit smooth muscle can be only controlled by the nervous system. It has only neurogenic control. Now, independently of the smooth muscle being organized in a single unit or in a multi-unit, we see that the cells in the smooth muscle have this spindle shape. They are elongated, and we do not see striations. And the reason why we do not see striations is because the contractile proteins, the thin filaments and the thick filaments, are not arranged in a very organized way, as I drew in this diagram. So we have here the relaxed smooth muscle cell. And in the relaxed smooth muscle cell, I drew the thick and thin filaments, which are the contractile proteins named myosin and actin. Myosin is the thick filament and the actin is the thin filament. Myosin is the one in green and actin is the one in purple. Now what happens is that the actin thin filament is attached to the dense bodies of the smooth muscle cell. And the dense bodies are these little balls that you're seeing that basically serve as anchoring points for the actin filaments. And the dense bodies are all interconnected by the intermediate filaments. And that is very important for the way that the smooth muscle cells contract. Now, we have the thick myosin filament and the thin actin filament. And the way contraction happens is by the myosin pulling on the actin. So let's imagine that here we have the myosin thick filament and we have like the myosin head right here. And this is the magnified version of what you're seeing right here where I wrote myosin, okay? Now, when you look at that, you can expect that the thin filament, actin, will be, for example, right here and right here, right? Like this. And at the endings, you would find the dense bodies. Now, when we say that myosin pulls on actin, what literally is happening is that the myosin head grabs the actin and pulls in this direction. And when this happens, the actin filaments that are anchored in one dense body, for example, this one, is getting closer to the actin filament that's anchored in the other dense body. So at the end, we have the dense bodies getting closer to one another. But all dense bodies are interconnected by the intermediate filaments. And when this all happens, what we have at the end is the dense bodies all over the smooth muscle cell getting closer to one another. And since they are all interconnected by intermediate filaments, the whole cell crunches up and looks like those mesh stress balls that when you squeeze, the things go through the little holes and it looks like this. So that is the way a smooth muscle cell contracts. And in order for a smooth muscle cell to contract, we only need three things. We need a stimulus that is strong enough to stimulate that cell. So we need a threshold stimulus, we need ATP, and we need calcium ions. So the recipe for contraction is a muscle cell, threshold stimulus, ATP, and calcium ions. And in the skeletal muscle part of this lecture, I will tell you specifically what the ATP and the calcium ions do in muscle contraction.